Hey guys, tonight we're going to trudge slowly up into the misty Andes, where the stars blink a little closer and the air smells like dust, llama fur, and mountain thyme. You're standing on ancient land, now really ancient, where food has to fight to survive, just like the people who grew it. Here, you don't have a fridge, you don't even have salt. You have wind, frost, sun, and a handful of clever tricks passed down through 1,000 generations. Up at 14,000 feet above sea level, you're not just cold, you're in danger of freezing solid by morning. And that, surprisingly, is exactly what ancient Peruvians were counting on. Then, each morning, the farmers walk out, and get this, they stomp on them. No salt, no additives, no plastic wrap, just mountain weather and stubborn human grit. Historians still argue whether chuno was invented in one region and spread, or whether multiple Andean cultures stumbled onto it independently. Either way, it became a cornerstone of survival. Literally, barefoot or in simple sandals. They press out the water, breaking down the cells. The next night, the freezing returns, and then the stomping, freeze, stomp, dry in the sun, freeze again. Ever heard of naturally mummified bodies found in the Andes? Some of them still have skin, eyelashes, even hair, their entire storage system. Their way of feeding villagers, armies, and pilgrims across thousands of miles all relied on this first principle. The mountain is your pantry. Thanks to the cold, dry, thin air, time slows down. In your hand, that tiny, freeze-dried potato doesn't look like much. But in ancient Peru, it was the difference between abundance and hunger, between survival and silence. For people, that's kind of unsettling. But for potatoes, perfect. But tonight, it's just you, the wind, and a potato hard as moon rock. You do this for several days, and what you get, ruined spedits chuno. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. I read every one, but toss it into a soup or a stew, and suddenly it wakes up again, softens, thickens, feeds. You see, these highlands aren't just harsh, they're helpful. Priests served it to the gods. Farmers used it as tax payments. But here, you're watching a barefoot farmer with calloused feet and sun-wrinkled skin doing the same trick, with no factory, no machines, just ice, heat, and rhythm. And when the Spanish arrived, one of the first things they noticed was how food in these mountains didn't rot, it just waited. The nighttime temperatures plummet below freezing, and the days beam down with a dry sun strong enough to bake clay. These aren't the buttery, smooth yellow ones you mash for Thanksgiving. People built their lives around the preservation calendar. You do know it was time to stomp the potatoes when the frost bit your nose just right. You didn't need a thermometer, you had the bones in your fingers and the breath of your llamas to tell you the season. The wind-up here could strip paint off a wall if there were any walls with paint. It's so dry, you wonder if your own lips are cracking. That's exactly what the people here counted on. Cold nights, dry wind, strong sun, the perfect recipe not for cooking, but for preserving. These are knobby, tough little roots that survive in volcanic dirt and icy wind. Some are purple, some red, some even black. The ancestors of today's potato weren't just food. They were survival packed in a starch capsule. But getting the harvest to last wasn't just about digging and eating it. Was about engineering an entire preservation system from the environment. Which is good, because if you want your food to last through the next dry season or a famine, or a war, you've got to learn how to store it, using nothing but thin air and stone huts. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, where Are you listening from tonight? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start in the Andes, where potatoes don't just grow, they dominate. You watch as Quechua farmers, dressed in bright woven tunics and woolen hats, spread their potatoes across a stone terrace. It all starts with frost. At night, the potatoes freeze solid. Chuno is like the original freeze-dried food. Small, chalk-white, and feather-light, it lasts for years. You pick one up, it's hard as a rock, and tastes like the ghost of a potato, earthy, dusty, a little bit, not just a survival food. Chuno was part of military campaigns, religious offerings, and economic systems. Armies carried it like rations. You imagine modern hikers with freeze-dried meals in shiny foil packets. And it wasn't just potatoes. The entire highland environment was like one giant refrigerator meat. That's another thing. The air up here does something strange. It preserves things, but not just food. The Inca and the many civilizations before them learned not just to live here, but to thrive. They didn't fight the mountain, they collaborated with it. So here you are, crouched on a stone terrace, thousands of years old, a bundle of chuno beside you, the Milky Way swirling above like a dusting of flour in the sky. Tomorrow, you'll learn how these same highlanders stored entire harvests for years. Not just potatoes, but corn, beans, quinoa, foods meant to outlast a season and feed empires. You squint at the horizon where the sun is beginning to stretch over the jagged spines of the Andes, casting long golden stripes over frost-covered fields. It's time to stomp potatoes. Again, your toes are freezing, the air is razor thin, and there's a faint headache pulsing behind your eyes. But here in the highlands, this is just another normal morning. You roll up your woven sleeves, take a breath that feels like breathing through gauze, and get to work. You step barefoot onto a patch of frozen tubers. The crunch is oddly satisfying, not like stepping on autumn leaves but close. The temperature difference between night and day is extreme freezing 1 hour, sunburn the next. It's this drama that makes preservation possible. One for soup, one for stew, one for ceremonial dishes, one for trade, and one just in case something bad happened, because up here, something bad is never more than a mist rain away. The result? A product that's dry, firm, feather-light, and resistant to decay for up to a decade. These lightweight nuggets were perfect for packing onto llamas, the Peruvian pickup trucks of the Andes. Llamas, unlike horses or oxen, could tread the narrow mountain trails without slipping to their doom. Chuno keeps its starch, yes, but it also concentrates the potato's minerals. What it loses in moisture, it gains in portability and longevity. Families would gather to stomp, wash, and dry potatoes together, often singing songs passed down through the generations. Kids would play among the drying fields. Dogs snoozed nearby, and elders recounted the worst frosts in living memory, probably exaggerating a bit, as elders do. Add a little protein, some dried alpaca meat or a fistful of beans, and you've got a complete slightly chewy meal. Some highland communities believed that chuno had protective qualities, that it could ward off spirits of hunger and disease. It tastes simple, earthy, slightly sour, but comforting in a way that modern convenience food just isn't. But for now, you tuck a few pale potato marbles into your woven pouch, not because you're hungry, just because it feels like carrying wisdom in your pocket. Around you, the wind whispers, carrying with it the knowledge of centuries and the soft laughter of children who've probably never seen a microwave, not because it was mystical in itself, but because it represented care, planning, and collective resilience. You didn't make chuno because you were desperate. You made Chuno because you were smart enough not to be later. So Chuno went where you went up to temple sites, across the empire, or into your neighbor's granary as tribute. 10 years. Your freezer can't even do that without getting freezer burn. Think of it like a food bank crossed with a spreadsheet. Except the spreadsheet was probably a knotted string of Kipu Inca record-keeping cords, made of alpaca fiber. He'd said something about Chuno being more reliable than the gods. A joke, maybe, or maybe not. The farmers around you are rhythmically pressing and squeezing the potatoes with their feet, rotating them to get all sides, as if performing some ancient grape-stomping dance with a lot less wine and a lot more ice. You'd receive offerings of Chuno at temple festivals, and yes, you'd bring Chuno to weddings and funerals not as leftovers, but as sacred staples. But today, you're learning just how varied and strategic Chuno making really is. Turns out, not all Chuno is created equal. It allowed for military campaigns far from home, pilgrimage routes with food caches along the way, and disaster relief for regions hit by drought or frost. Imagine having food reserves so durable they could outlast not just seasons, but rulers. There's white Chuno which gets the full wash, stomp, and sun-bleach treatment turned black Chuno, which skips the rinse and stays darker and stronger in flavor, often used in hearty stews, like choosing between mild salsa and 5-alarm chili. Andean chefs had options. A few chuckle as you wince there. Cold bites differently when it's underfoot. Some even suggest the black Chuno's bitterness was intentional, a culinary reminder of hardship or reverence during sacred meals. Either way, the spectrum of freeze-dried potatoes was more than just food. It was cultural code, economic tool, and survival insurance. The product of this strange ritual is Chuno, the Andean miracle food you met last night. Historians still argue whether black Chuno was a shortcut born from necessity or a separate technique with distinct ritual meaning. Now, what happens after the stomping, drying? You help spread the semi-shriveled potatoes onto straw mats, where they lie for several days under the scorching sun. You imagine a pantry filled wall-to-wall with cloth sacks of Chuno, each labeled not by date but by elevation, variety, and purpose. Chuno wasn't just made for eating, it was made for moving. You remember how you trailed behind that farmer yesterday, your pockets full of curiosity and your breath short from the altitude? And let's talk nutrition. But Chuno's importance wasn't only in some regions, it was so central that it became currency. You'd pay taxes in Chuno. There's even evidence that Chuno was stored in communal facilities, overseen by administrators who took note of quantities, locations, and redistribution needs. Some scholars believe the existence of Chuno helped expand and sustain the Inca Empire's vast network. And here is something you didn't expect. The Chuno making process wasn't just practical, it was community bonding. But in the midst of all this methodical preservation, there's still room for magic. So, as the sun finally dips below the peaks again, you find yourself chewing on a rehydrated Chuno stew by a small hearth fire. Tomorrow, you will step inside the Highland Colchester cold storage stone huts that kept not just Chuno, but whole harvests safe from time. You wake to the sound of wind tapping gently at a stone wall, an ancient whisper against ancient architecture. You're standing before a kulka now, one of the Andean highlands' most underrated marvels. From the outside, it's nothing flashy, just a squat, circular stone building with a sloped thatched roof. But walk inside, and you're stepping into a prehistoric refrigerator built entirely from intuition and stone. You duck through the doorway, cool air brushing your cheeks like the sigh of a mountain ghost. Even though the sun outside is sharp and hot enough to tan your arms in 15 minutes flat, it's 10 degrees cooler in here. Inside, There's no musty smell, no hint of rot, just dry, cool air. These storage facilities weren't the property of one family, but often the whole community. You realize that a civilization without thermometers or hygrometers had figured out humidity management centuries before Europe was even bottling wine properly. The Inca Empire stretched over 2,500 miles from the equator down into what is now Chile. He described being offered food from a cuca that had been harvested 5 years prior. Still edible, still nourishing, still better than the weevil-ridden bread the Spanish brought from Europe. You're struck by the silence of the structure, how it just works without any moving parts, without intervention, without electricity. The smell of stored maize, earthy, dusty, almost sweet, lingers in the air. This isn't just food storage. It's dignity in design. It's a civilization that dared to grow in terrain most people would flee from. And they didn't just survive, they thrived. Just thoughtful design, shaped by relentless necessity, and every few miles, along every main road, stood storehouses like this one. Some scholars estimate there were over 10,000 kulkas at the empire's height. But before that, you stretch out in the shade of the kulka, letting your hand rest on the ancient stone, marveling that in this harshest of places, humanity found a way to make abundance last. Imagine a string of rural convenience stores, except instead of soda and chips, they held emergency rations for soldiers, pilgrims, and anyone else who needed to not starve. An early version of socialized food insurance. If the rains failed, the kulka opened. If a village flooded, food was sent from neighboring granaries. There was even a rotating surplus system, where older food was redistributed before it aged out, and new harvests were slotted in by the keeper's officials tasked with managing the bounty. These guys weren't farmers, they were food logistics. Today, you'd call them warehouse managers. Back then, they were practically priests of the pantry. Either way, thousands of these food storage huts once dotted the Andes, clay jars sealed with cloth and resin-hulled beans, amaranth, and quinoa. The storage isn't random. It's methodical, even ceremonial. This is food security. Some were built along roads, others near fields, and some, like the one you're crouching inside, were perched dramatically on cliff edges, making full use of the biting winds. That's right, an empty building, right beside the full one. Why? Scholars still debate it. Some say it helped control airflow and humidity. Others believe it was symbolic, a kind of yin and yang, of presence and absence, matter and void. Or maybe it was just the ancient Andean version of, let's build a backup in case something collapses. Ventilation slits up high, keep air circulating, pushing out humidity. The floor is elevated, sometimes raised on stilts, other times made of packed gravel so moisture can't creep up from below. Cold. Not fridge cold, but cold enough to matter. And all of it powered by nothing more than rock, wind, and altitude. There's no mold, no mice, no buzzing flies, just stone, straw, and science disguised as tradition. You might not think about airflow when you're stuffing your pantry, but the Incas definitely did. And not just because it's shady. These people who didn't have the wheel, let alone modern engineering degrees, designed the kulka to breathe. Literally, the walls are thick, built from locally sourced stone, stacked with gaps left intentionally to let the wind pass through. Historians still argue whether kulkas were all part of a master plan under centralized control, or if local communities adapted a general design for their own needs. Inside, the layout is strategic. Chuno might occupy one corner, maize another. Dried meats hang from ceiling beams. You touch the walls, and it wasn't just about keeping food cool, it was about keeping it safe. And the locations? Genius. Some cookers were placed where wind would be strongest, others where morning sun could help dry, damp interior corners. The more you explore, the more you realize these weren't just buildings, they were nodes in a vast storage and distribution network. You remember reading about a Spanish chronicler, one of the many wide-eyed colonists trying to make sense of this empire in the clouds, who was stunned by the Inca food reserves. Here is a fun fringe tidbit for you. Some cocas were built in pairs, one to store goods, and the other to store air. As the sun climbs higher, you step out from the cool belly of the coca into the dry blaze of midday. You sit beside the stone wall and close your eyes. Wind whistles softly through the ventilation slits. Tonight, you'll join a llama caravan transporting food from one mountain outpost to another. You hear them before you see them, the soft clop-clop of hooves on stone, the occasional snort, the swish of rope harnesses brushing against shaggy wool. Then the first llama rounds the bend, head held high, like it owns the trail. Chuno, dried corn, smoked fish, even medicinal herbs, all wrapped tightly in woven cloth. These llamas were the empire's couriers, pack animals of the Andes, capable of navigating treacherous cliffs, narrow switchbacks and mountain passes that would send a donkey into full rebellion. It's headed to one of the many Stetron colcas, part of a broader redistribution system. The Inca Empertawantins ran on roads and food, and llamas were the arteries. The rope is made of braided alpaca wool, surprisingly soft but strong. Right now, you're marveling at the logistics. Roads built across swamps, over ravines, through mountain walls, rope bridges swaying over canyons so deep your stomach flips just looking, and through it all, the llama caravan stylus, patient and well-fed on wild grasses. The food is wrapped in cloth, dyed in deep reds and yellows, and when you peek inside, you spot perfect ears of dried corn, each kernel glossy and oversized, nothing like the popcorn nubs you're used to. You picture the whole thing. Villages nestled in valleys, farmers harvesting maize and potatoes, herders loading up their woolly cargo carriers, and then a slow, steady march over impossible terrain. They carried prestige items, coca leaves, ceremonial chicha beer, feathers, and even mummified ancestors being paraded to shrines where there was none, and meat where no beast had grazed. He was only half right. They didn't have bread, but they had chuno, and with llamas, it could go just about anywhere. In that sense, llamas weren't just beasts of burden. Below, you spot a colca cluster near a river bend, a few thatched roofs catching the afternoon light like warm coins. This is the next drop-off. The food will be logged, sorted, and stored by keepers who know just how much each family needs, how much to save, and how much to send onward. They were part of the spiritual and political life of the empire. You needed to know that food would reach the next village, the next garrison, the next temple. You chew slowly, grateful for something to distract from your aching knees. As you rest, you begin to appreciate the true genius of the Inca system. It wasn't about creating luxury, because up here, in the land where the air is thin and time moves slow, survival isn't a miracle. It's a system will-covered, wind-powered, and carved into the bones of the mountains. It was about building predictability in an unpredictable landscape, and you needed to know it wouldn't spoil on the way. That's where chuno, dried meat, and sun-hardened maize come in, guiding their animals with practiced ease, and he keeps glancing back at you like he's judging your hiking stamina. You try not to take it personally, and unlike horses, llamas don't need much water, which matters a lot in this land of glaciers, deserts, and unpredictable rains. He tells you in a blend of Quechua and Spanish that his grandfather used to lead caravans to Cusco when he was a boy. Even now, some communities retrace those paths, not out of necessity, but to preserve memory, to keep the pulse of the mountains beating. No leashes, no shouting, just rhythm and respect. Which, to be fair, it kind of does. A choreography that made it possible to feed armies, conduct trade, hold festivals, and respond to crises, all without refrigeration, all without wheels. You step aside as the caravan trudges past dozens of llamas in single file, each carrying tidy bundles of food lashed to its back. You fall in step beside them, marveling at how this high-altitude delivery system ran smoothly long before the first FedEx truck sputtered to life. Each llama can carry about 25 to 30 kilograms, not much compared to an ox, but much more useful when your road is a cliff's edge with no guardrail. The truth probably lies somewhere in between a flexible web of authority and autonomy. What's clear is that without llama caravans and preserved food, the system would have collapsed under its own weight. The food they're carrying isn't just going from farm to home. Historians still argue how centralized this system was. Did the emperor control every bean? Or did local leaders coordinate their own stores with loose, imperial oversight? You pause to help retire a bundle on one llama's back. This is the backbone of Andean agriculture, but more on that later. They don't move quickly. A good caravan might cover 20 kilometers a day, depending on terrain. But speed wasn't the point, reliability was. There is a llama just ahead, who seems particularly charismatic. He has a tuft of hair flopped dramatically over one eye. A young herder, no older than 16, walks beside you. You sip from your canteen warm, metallic water. The herder offers you a chunk of dried meat and a pinch of salted lupin beans, each pack jammer, each foot-worn trail, each strategically placed granarial part of a quiet, deliberate choreography. Here's a fringe fact to chew on: some llama caravans weren't just food haulers. One Spanish priest once wrote, probably with a mixture of awe and confusion, that the Inca system kept bread as the caravan crests a hill. The landscape opens, and you just keep walking, step after step, not fast, but steady. The crunch of your boots on gravel shifts now to a softer, almost musical rhythm as you step onto a terrace where maize stretches to the horizon. It's not the corn you're used to, no shiny yellow uniformity here. Each carb has been husked and turned slightly to face the sun. Positioned like sunbathers on a beach towel, the smell in the air is warm and sweet, like dusty popcorn left in the sun. This is how ancient Peruvians preserved corn, not with chemicals, not in cans, but by mastering the choreography of light and airflow. Each ear is a unique mosaic: blue, red, purple, yellow, speckled, and striped. Some kernels are the size of thumbnails, so glossy they almost look fake, but they're very real and very important, and ground into flour for making humitas, kind of like tamales. But with a highland twist, you imagine festivals with entire villagers cooking maize in every form imaginable: roasted, boiled, fermented, toasted, a parade of corn. Some were for offerings, only never touched by mortal mouths. You spot a few dark purple cobs set aside on a stone slab. Their color is so deep, it's almost black. The farmer explains that these are for api, a thick, sweet ceremonial drink made only during certain festivals. Not for daily use, not for trade, just ritual. Corn cobs were hung or stacked in ways that maximized exposure to sun and wind. No mildew, just patience. The Inca system, you recall, ran on mitaa, form of taxed labor, where people worked for the state in exchange for food and protection. Like the mountain, itself quiet, tough, and unshaken by time. and where people figured out how to keep seafood from rotting centuries before refrigeration. And maize was the paycheck. Work on a temple wall? Here's some corn. Build a road? More corn. Join a military campaign? Better corn. In your lap is a cloth pouch half filled with kernels. In your mind, the quiet awe of realizing that this humble grain-fed gods, empires, and everyone in between, maybe even some tuno on the side. Drop a few on the ground, watch how they scatter, and you've got the god's opinion on your marriage prospects. A primitive abacus made of corn. It's all so integrated, you wonder if there's anything this grain didn't do. It was a unit of value in an empire without coins. Some scholars believe the Inca road network was designed in part to move maize efficiently from surplus zones to deficit ones, like veins moving blood to hungry muscles, corn as food, fortune teller, and friend. That's why it's treated with such care. You nod, unsure whether it's metaphor or memory, but here, those lines are always blurry. Once dried, the kernels were either left on the cob or popped off and stored in cloth insect-proof, and stashed inside culkus, where the temperature kept them from spoiling. You bend down and pluck an ear from a drying rack, wooden beams arranged in sunlit grids. These aren't just food processors, they're economic engines. The sun isn't just shining, it's working overtime. Either way, Andean farmers took the idea and ran with it, developing dozens of regional varieties, each tailored to a specific altitude, soil type, and microclimate. Think of it as the original locally grown movement, except instead of farmers' markets, there were state-run distribution hubs. Corn, or was more than just a side dish. It was sustenance, ceremony, storage, and symbol. The Incas and their ancestors bred it carefully for kernels that could last for years when properly dried and stored. You hold one in your palm and feel the weight of it. Not just physical weight, but cultural. This little grain has fed armies, appeased gods, and outlasted empires. The kind of snack that could survive a 1,000-mile trek and still taste like sunshine. Ancient Peruvian diets weren't random. Maize, combined with legumes like lupins or beans, formed a complete protein source. Add in dried tubers and a bit of meat, and you've got a meal fit for an emperor, at least a hungry llama herder. You learn that the drying process began immediately after harvest. Historians still argue whether corn cultivation in the Andes developed independently or borrowed techniques from Mesoamerica. You take a kernel and bite it hard as a pebble, but with a subtle sweetness. And maize wasn't just for chewing. It was brewed into chicha, the sacred corn beer you'll sip later in your journey. You pass an elder farmer who tells you without stopping work that corn was once a living being, a spirit who offered herself to feed the people. Not all maize was created equal. Some types were specifically bred to be stored for years. Others were for quick consumption, a fringe tidbit. Some Andean communities used colored corn kernels as a divination tool. Inside one of the stone houses on the terrace edge, you see a mother teaching her daughter how to string kernels into a necklace, not for decoration, but for counting. And of course, maize was wealth. It could be stored, traded, taxed, or offered. You look back toward the valley, where rows of drying racks form a golden quilt over the land. One llama caravan you passed earlier was loaded entirely with maize knots to eat, but to be distributed as labor payment. You pluck one last cob from the rack and turn it in your hands. It's not flashy, but it's proud. Tomorrow, you'll journey to the coast, where fish is being sun-dried by the ocean breeze. But for now, as the afternoon light melts into long shadows across the maize terraces, you'll rest against a sun-warmed stone wall. You trade the high-altitude chill for a warm, salty breeze as you descend from the Andes to the Peruvian coast. The air here feels heavier, thicker, and it clings to your skin with that familiar coastal humidity. But look closer, it's rows and rows of anchovies, sardines, and other small fish spread across woven mats and flat stones, glinting in the sunlight like forgotten coins, pungent, fishy, with attempts of salt and ocean weed, but it is not unpleasant, more like the comforting scent of a fishing village doing what it has done for thousands of years. You crouch down beside a line of drying fish and realize you re-participating in a practice that began long before the Inca, stretching back to cultures like the Moche. Here, the sea provided, and people learned quickly how to make its gifts last. Either way, it's clear that these sun-dried fish ended up far from the coast, even making it into the highland cocas you visited earlier. A trout might have been caught within sight of the Pacific and eaten months later in a village 3,000 meters above sea level. This is where preservation meets the Pacific. It's chewy, smoky, salty, but, again, not from actual salt. Some fish were smoked over fire as an extra precaution, especially during humid months, and when storms wiped out fresh catches or red tides poisoned the waters. These preserved stores meant the difference between hunger and survival. Others were treated with chicha vinegar or acidic juices from native fruits, a clever use of fermentation that discouraged bacteria. They were about calories, protein, fat, the basics. No labels, no refrigeration, no fuss, just fish that might sit there for 6 months or 2 years and still be ready when needed. These dried fish were the quiet heroes of ancient logistics. But how Andean people preserved food without the mineral we so often take for granted, and seabirds swirling like threads of ink in the sky. You take a moment to appreciate this quiet coastline. It doesn't shout for attention. It simply provides fish, sun, wind, and the genius to turn that into survival. You'll discover how fermentation, acidity, and airflow turned even perishables into pantry staples. Preservation wasn't just about drying it, it was about layering defense systems. But even this change in climate didn't stop the ancient Peruvians from figuring out how to preserve food specifically fit. Lots of fish, a particularly large or well-preserved fish, might be offered as part of a bride's gift. A symbolic way of saying, our family knows how to keep food on the table. You find yourself walking through what looks like a field of silver leaves, fluttering in the sun. The smoke curls around your clothes, your hair clinging like perfume. Imagine it. Instead of every community having to rely solely on nearby crops or fresh meat, preserved fish allowed cities to grow in places where food would otherwise be unreliable. The gentle chatter of people who've done this their whole lives. It's not flashy, but it's timeless. A very seafood-forward perfume. The smell is strong. No denying it. Unlike the highlands, where frost did the preserving, the coast relied on sun and wind. The key here was speed, catch, gut, dry, store. The technique is so fluid, so practiced, you almost miss the tiny knife. She uses a sliver of obsidian so sharp it makes modern stainless steel look clumsy. She tells you that her grandmother taught her, and her grandmother learned it from her grandmother, and on and on. If you waited too long, the fish would spoil. But if you moved fast and worked smart, you could have protein all year round. A few hours in the sun, sometimes a full day, and they're ready. Once dried, they're packed in layers with reeds or wrapped in cloth and stacked in baskets. No ice, no salt, just air and experience. You watch as a woman expertly cleans a fresh catch, laying it flat like she's opening a book. The fish dry quickly in this climate. Historians still debate whether coastal people traded these preserved fish inland directly, or whether they passed through layers of exchange via llama caravans. You're offered a bite. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. In some coastal regions, dried fish weren't just food, they were currency and even marriage dowry. You pass rows of fish smoking slowly over low fires, nothing fancy, just driftwood and volcanic stones. There's something oddly calming about this scene. The rhythm of the waves, the flicker of drying fish. Coastal societies didn't just rely on anchovies. They preserved shellfish, seaweed, even shark meat. And here's where things get even more interesting. Some archaeologists believe the abundance of preserved coastal fish helped fuel urban development inland, and the trade routes, you realize, weren't just about shiny objects or ceremonial goods. As the sun lowers in the sky, the mats of fish begin to disappear, packed away, bundled tightly and stored in cool rooms carved into stone. Tomorrow, you'll dive into the truly weird world of saltless preservation. Not just what was done with fish or corn, but for now, as you walk back along the beach, past tide pools glowing in the twilight. You're back inland now, but not quite in the mountains this time. You're meandering through a dry valley, where the sun beats down without mercy and the wind feels more like breath from a brick oven than a breeze. There's no ocean here, no frost, and yet something delicious is bubbling in clay pots. This is the Andean secret: saltless preservation. You duck beneath a simple red canopy and left to ferment until its sugars turn tangy and its shelf life stretches far beyond what nature intended. You take a bite, soft, chewy, with a bit of zingand. Suddenly your mouth realizes it's not eating something fresh, but something transformed. So instead, they leaned into acidic environments where bacteria couldn't thrive. Tubers like mashua, oca, and aluco were fermented until their natural sugars became preservatives themselves. But not if you know the trick. Slightly floury, with an earthy aftertaste. Not gourmet, but you can taste the patience it took to make it safe. Fringe fact: some ancient texts describe tawi as sacred, reserved for warriors or leaders, not because it was delicious, but because it symbolized transformation. A toxic seed, these cheeses could be crumbled into stews or eaten with. You try a piece and instantly feel your tongue stick to the roof of your mouth. It's dry, but rich. Your stomach feels warm, your brain a little fuzzy, and your appreciation for ancient ingenuity grows with every burp, made nourishing through time and care. And your mind slightly fermented from all the stories, scents, and secrets the Andes have offered up. Were they common knowledge across the Andes, or confined to certain pockets of innovation? It was about transforming food, making it safer, yes, but also stronger, richer, layered. These weren't desperation techniques, they were intentional, refined over centuries, passed down by nose and tongue, not by thermometer or lab. The archaeological record suggests both. Regional adaptations paired with empire-wide diffusion. In simpler terms, if it worked in one valley, it probably got copied in another eventually. There's probably a metaphor in there for someone. First, you soak it in cold mountain water, sometimes a stream, sometimes in red baskets submerged in ponds for days. Then you dry it. The bitter compounds leach out, leaving behind a soft, nutty bean that stores beautifully and keeps for ages when dried again after soaking. Some foods were suspended in the rafters of thatched homes or granaries, where they caught constant airflow. Meats, fruits, even soft cheeses would desiccate in place, becoming shelf-stable over time. No refrigeration, no smoke, just altitude and patience. You chew another piece and realize this food doesn't just last, it has character. And join a family gathered around their open-air kitchen. At the center, a large jar is uncorked. Fruits, Chuco's frostbitten cousin, a literal pit. But not angry, he says with a smile. makes sense, in a way, dug deep into dry earth and lined with grasses. Inside, clay jars filled with preserved grain paste. The smell is funky, sour, oddly nutty. It's a kind of pre-modern miso, made from fermented maize or legumes. Still edible, still nutritious, and somewhat surprisingly still legal. Made with similar stomp and freeze methods. It's often rinsed more thoroughly and ends up lighter in color and subtler in flavor. Combined with fermented tubers or beans, it makes a stew you could eat for days. And it keeps 4 years. In the highlands, people laid out native fruits like lucuma, cherimoya and tumbo in thin slices, letting the high-altitude sun and dry air turn them into leathery slivers of sweetness. No sugar added. New preservatives, just the Andean sun doing what it does best. And unlike the heavy salting techniques of other ancient civilizations, these folks preferred subtler preservation methods, ones that didn't rely on bulky, scarce mineral resources. A rich, sour scent rushes up to greet you. Not bad, just alive, food fresh-smelling, but made from ingredients stored for weeks, months, maybe even longer. So how are they doing it without ice, without refrigeration, and surprisingly without salt? The answer is as old as fermentation and as clever as airflow. This is oca, a sweet tart Andean tuber that's been soaked, dried. Ancient Peruvians weren't content with just drying things. They embraced fermentation, controlled decay, and chemical change as part of their culinary science. Salt existed, sure, some natural deposits, some from evaporated coastal ponds, but it wasn't common or cheap. Historians still argue whether the fermentation methods used here were inspired by observation, like accidentally leaving tubers too long in water, or if they were intentionally engineered from the start. Either way, the technique evolved into a refined art. Take tawi, for example, a highland legume packed with protein but naturally bitter and mildly toxic. Sounds like a bad lunch date, right? You try one. You move on to preserved fruits, yes. Then there's Moria. You pass a storage pit. You ask one of the elders how they know when something has fermented correctly. He shrugs and points to his nose. When it smells alive, here's another technique you wouldn't expect. Airflow preservation. In extremely dry regions, and yet some Andean communities made early versions of it, though usually in small batches, pressed and dried rather than aged. Scholars debate just how widespread these fermentation and air-drying techniques were. You're beginning to realize that ancient Peruvian preservation wasn't just about fighting decay. As twilight stretches across the valley, you sit beneath a thatched overhang, sipping a tart drink made from fermented purple corn and mountain spices. Tomorrow, you'll head to the islands off the coast, where seabirds left behind a resource so potent it turned barren land into farmland, gave the preserved food a boost you never saw coming. But tonight, you lie back against a clay jar still warm from the sun, your fingers sticky from oca syrup. You're on a boat now, well, more like a raft, really gliding over calm waters toward a small rocky island that looks from a distance like someone tipped a giant sack of flour over it. But as you draw closer, you realize it's not flour, it's bird poop. So much bird. This, oddly enough, is the next secret in the ancient Peruvian food puzzle. Watch your step, he says. The Incas didn't just protect this stuff. They made laws about it. You've arrived at an island thick with guanas, the droppings of countless seabirds who roosted here for centuries. It's not glamorous, it's not fragrant, and it's definitely not something you'd want on your shoes. Access was restricted. Overharvesting was punishable. and some islands were off-limits entirely during nesting season to ensure the birds kept producing. You squint up at the sky, where gulls and cormorants swirl like lazy dancers. It's pungent, yes, but also earthy, almost like strong compost. Farmers inland would trade for it, eagerly bartering chuno, textiles, or even labor hours for a single sack. And once applied to a terraced field high in the Andes, that guano transformed the output. You realize that this isn't just a one-step solution. It's one piece in a long chain from guano, to crops, to harvests, to chuno, to colchos, to caravans villagers miles away. You start to see them less as annoying background noise and more as the feathery stewards of a food empire. It sparked actual wars. Nations fought over it. Peru made treaties about it. And yet, the ancient Peruvians had figured it all out centuries earlier, quietly scooping and storing this unlikely treasure in baskets made of reeds. After all, it came from the sky, dropped by birds that skimmed the ocean and returned to the cliffs. Your hands still smell faintly of ochre, and your mind is full of wonder that even bird droppings had their sacred role. You watch the island shrink behind you, returning to its strange guano-colored disguise. You'll see how food, storage, and society were all held together, not with paper or pen, but with string and memory. Another silent player in the food empire you're slowly coming to understand. Some saw it as a gift from the gods of sea and sky proof. That balance could be maintained if humans respected nature's cycles. Either way, by the time of the Inca Empire, it was a state-controlled resource, predicting hunger, preventing disaster, storing not just food, but time, future calories, future feasts, future security. Even bird poop, unpleasant as it may be, fit perfectly into that grand design. You expected something more high-tech or, at least more ventilated, but it's simple. No need for fancy structures when the goal is just to keep the rain off and the product moving. These sacks will be loaded onto red boats like yours and floated back to the mainland where they'll continue their quiet mission, helping plants grow so they can be preserved later. Because long before synthetic fertilizers and high-yield hybrid crops, there were seabirds circling over islands of guano, and people who looked up and saw possibility, not just mess. Guano collectors worked under strict supervision, and its distribution was recorded via quipu, those complex knotted strings used as accounting ledgers. But it's gold. Agricultural gold, because this stuff, sun-dried and pungent, is one of the most powerful natural fertilizers in the world. You step ashore, careful not to slip, and your guide chuckles. Turns out, guano was so important to Andean agriculture that certain islands were declared sacred. But how does bird poop connect to food preservation? Simple. It allowed food growth in places where it shouldn't have been possible. In coastal valleys where rainfall was practically a myth, guano-enriched soil turned scrubland into farmland. Farmers could grow maize, beans, squash, things that normally wouldn't stand a chance under the dry sun. And once you could grow more, you could preserve more. Historians still argue whether the use of guano was developed independently or borrowed from earlier cultures like the Ch. You kneel beside a small pile of granulated guano, now bagged and ready to be shipped inland. There is a fringe belief among some Andean elders that guano held spiritual power, that it wasn't just nutrient-rich. Your guide leads you to a storeroom where sacks of guano are kept dry beneath palm thatch roofing. There's a moment of calm as you sit on the edge of the boat, legs dangling above clear water, the scent of seabird fertilizer slowly fading from your nostrils. And when you zoom out, You see, the whole system was about anticipation. You hear the distant cries of seabirds echoing between the cliffs and wonder how many generations of farmers whispered thanks to them. Probably more than a few. And here's your quirky tidbit of the day. At one point during the 19th century, long after the Incas were gone, the world rediscovered guano. As the boat pushes off from the island, the water laps gently against the hull. Tomorrow, you'll venture into the world of Quipu, those knotted strings that recorded more than just guano shipments. But tonight, as the sky turns orange and the sea reflects it like polished copper, you lean back in the boat. Your stomach is full of sun-dried anchovies. You're back on dry land now, walking along a winding path that leads through a quiet highland village. There's the scent of wood smoke in the air, mingling with the earthiness of adobe walls and the occasional burst of roasting maize. But you're not here to eat, at least, not yet. You're here to unravel a mystery that held the whole food system together. A series of strings, knots, and memories called Quipu. Historians still argue whether Quipu encoded full written language or just numerical records. We know that numbers were definitely recorded using a based-in system. Imagine being a state official in a mountain village. You manage 5 kolkas, each with hundreds of kilograms of maize, beans, and freeze-dried potatoes. You need to report monthly inventories to Cusco. You can't send a written letter. Writing doesn't exist in your world, so you send a quipucamiok, a specially trained keeper of the knots. The quipucamiok might hum or chant as they interpreted a record, embedding memory deeper through melody. Some experts think it was a narrative piece, maybe a tale of migration, or even a map disguised as memory. It might have described where to find the best chuno fields, or warned of a past famine. We'll likely never know. A young girl walks beside you, holding a simple cord in her hands. She ties a knot, shows you, then laughs when you try to copy her. Yours looks like a tiny spaghetti accident. Hers, a perfect single digit. The pitch of their voice helped remember not just how much food was stored. Some communities today are reviving the art, not out of nostalgia, but for the quiet satisfaction of connecting back to a system built on memory, trust, and thread. And your thoughts unravel slowly, gently like yarn pulled free by wind. But why it was stored, where it came from, and who deserved it next. Every knot, a calorie, every string, a plan, every preserved potato, a promise. A knot near the top of a string might stand for tens, one near the bottom for single digits. They tied up dates, read incoming Quipu, and ensured that food didn't disappear between farm and table. You try tying a few knots yourself, following the diagram. 1 knot, 2 knots, 3. It's clumsy at first, but then something clicks. There's a rhythm to it. Like braiding hair or tuning a string instrument. You start to get it, not the language, but the intention. Some were said to have entire village histories wrapped around their waists in long cords. It's hard not to picture them as living hard drives, walking from outpost to outpost, syncing data by candlelight. Add it all up, and you've got inventory of corn, chuno, dried fish, or even llama hides. At first glance, it doesn't look like much. A central cord, about the length of your forearm, with dozens, sometimes hundreds of thinner cords hanging from it like a jellyfish made of yarn. And right there, in a glass case, you see it, a preserved Quipu thought to record food rations from over 500 years ago. They even burned many Quipu after the conquest, thinking they were hiding heretical messages. Ironically, they may have deleted centuries of Andes files, never knowing whether they were just wiping out spreadsheets or libraries. The colors have faded once, rich reds, indigos and ochres, now muted like old velvet, but the knots remain, tightly tied, perfectly spaced, still readable, if you know the language. Each string is knotted in deliberate patterns. Some tight, others loose. Some clustered at the top, others spaced farther down. This isn't decoration. It's a data system. A full-blown accounting method without a single written word. Some scholars believe narrative quipu existed and were read like oral scrolls, with each knot tied not just to a number but to a phrase or memory. Others are skeptical, insisting that without a Rosetta Stone of some kind, we may never know. You duck into a storage building, one of the few remaining colonial-era structures that houses replica quipu displays. But that's the tricky part. What remains mysterious is whether these strings captured stories, names, and decisions if they held the thoughts of officials, not just their shopping lists. But what we do know is this. Quipu kept food moving. These menhirs usually men memorize not just the chords, but the stories behind them. You run your fingers along a replica cord, it's surprisingly soft, made of alpaca wool twisted with care. And here is your fringe fact. Some quipu were designed not just to be read, but sung. In the far corner of the room, an old wooden case holds a particularly unusual quipu. The colors are brighter, the knots looser, no numerical consistency. Yet somehow, the system worked. Spanish conquistadors wrote often with a note of frustration about quipu being used to organize rations, army movements, and taxes. You leave the building and walk toward the fields where new maize is being sown. The future of quipu might rest in hands like hers if, not to record food, then to remember how food was recorded. As the sun dips behind the mountains, you picture the empire not as a land of stone and gold, but of fiber and food. Tomorrow, you'll climb higher into the mountains and explore the astonishing agricultural terraces, vertical fields carved into cliffs that made all this food possible in the first place. But for now, you sit beneath a tree with a cord in your lap, absent-mindedly tying knots as your belly settles. Your boots scrape against stone as you climb higher, following a switchback trail that spirals up the side of a mountain that seems, frankly, like a ridiculous place to grow anything. Sheer cliffs, gravelly, soil, wind that slaps you sideways, but then just as you start questioning the sanity of ancient Andean farmers, you crest a ridge and stop. Each one carved neatly into the mountainside, bordered by retaining walls made of precision-fit stone, like shelves built to hold fields, or like someone sliced the mountain into layers and planted crops in each one. Before you is a staircase of green terraces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. This is Andean agricultural engineering at its boldest. These terraces, or Andines, weren't just practical, they were miraculous, all thriving in places where, logically, they shouldn't. It est the kind of farming that scoffs at you can't grow that here. The system is so precise that he can flood one level without affecting the others. Gravity isn't just tolerated here, it's recruited. They were reserved for ritual crops, ceremonial coca, or sacred mass intended only for festivals or offerings. Their harvests might not be eaten, but buried, burned, or blessed. Soil, in those cases, was less about sustenance and more about story. The kind of farming that says, "Watch me." Local communities maintained their own terrace systems, adapting imperial designs to regional needs. One village might specialize in barley, another in tubers, another in legumes, but somehow there's still quinoa growing in tidy rows, fluttering like red and gold feathers. You crouch and run your fingers through the stalks, marveling at how something so delicate survives up here. All interconnected, all supported by the food redistribution network you've been following since Section 1. Inside, Sacks of dried beans rest in shadow. The air is cool and dry. The kind of air that says, these will last. With them, water is gently absorbed, slowed, stored. He waves, then gestures for you to come see. You follow, and he shows you how the terrace edge is repaired using tightly placed stones with no mortar, just friction and fit. Somewhere below, a flute starts playing, soft and slow, and you realize you're not just learning how food was preserved. You're re-walking through the living memory of a people who refused to waste a single inch of earth. The work to build these must have been enormous, back-breaking, unrelenting, and yet they're still here, still producing, still feeding families. Centuries later, each stone is chosen with such care it feels like they were interviewing for the job. Second, temperature. Each level is its own microclimate. Plants at the bottom are cooler. Those at the top, toasty, perfect for heat-loving crops. The difference between levels can be as much as 10 degrees Celsius. That's like planting in multiple biomes on the same hill. Many of the crops grown here were meant for long-term preservation. Quinoa, for instance, could be dried and stored for years. Potatoes were destined to become chuno. But the view gets even more surreal. Below you now is a quilt of terraces stretching into the distance, divided by narrow footpaths and stone staircases. It's agriculture as sculpture, farming as architecture. Maize, we already know, would sunbathe itself into near immortality. A ruler who could command thousands to move earth, build walls, and channel water was a ruler worth respecting. Terraces became monuments as much as food factories. Proof of imperial power etched into mountainsides. These terraces weren't just for abundance. They were for durable abundance. You step down onto the first level and feel it immediately. The wind softens, the temperature shifts, and the ground under your feet feels unexpectedly fertile. Ancient Peruvians didn't just tame nature, they redesigned it. The terraces solved 100 problems in one go. First, erosion. Without them, rain would have turned these slopes into muddy waterfalls. Historians still debate whether some terraces were experimental labs for testing which crops grew best in different conditions. The Inca Agricultural Center at Moray, for example, is a spiral of descending terraces that might have been a greenhouse, a ventoletta, a sort of open-air agricultural spreadsheet. You reach down and pick up a handful of soil. It's dark, rich, crumbly. This wasn't just dirt, they found it's dirt. The Incas mixed organic compost, sand, and silt to form the perfect growing medium. Some terraces even have drainage, layers gravel at the bottom, followed by sand, then topsoil, basically a botanical layer cake. You pause to admire the view. Fields of quinoa, potatoes, beans, and maize. A local farmer passes by, leading a pair of oxen yoked to a wooden plough. Then he shows you his irrigation. Channel a narrow trench along the inside wall of the terrace, fed by glacial runoff and diverted spring water. And this isn't all about food for now. Your fringe tidbit. Some of the highest terraces grew nothing at all. You climb higher. The air thins. Breathing gets harder. Some scholars have argued that these terraces weren't just practical, they were political. But it wasn't all top-down. As you reach the top terrace, the wind picks up again. Cold. Thin. Nearby, a small kulka sits, tucked into the rocker modest granary. Its thatch roof, newly replaced. You sit on the edge of the wall, legs dangling over the drop, and look down at the terraces you just climbed. The slope is steep. Tomorrow, you will visit one of those festivals where preserved food takes center stage, a celebration not of fresh harvests, but of what's endured. But tonight, You'll stretch out on a smooth stone, warmed by the afternoon sun. The sky fades to lavender. The village is buzzing today. You feel it before you see it, the thump of drums, the squeal of panpipes, the ripple of voices rising and falling like birdsong. Not a refrigerator in sight, yet the sheer variety of foods displayed is staggering. Strips of dried llama meat, crispy and spicy, stacked next to bowls of chuno crumbled into thick stews, piles of toasted maize, baskets of dried fruit, rounds of air-dried cheese wrapped in cloth. It's like walking through a museum of ancient preservation, and everything's still edible. You've arrived just in time for a Rami, a seasonal festival that folds together harvest, memory, and celebration. And tonight's not about fresh-picked produce. It's about the food that survived. It's about resilience. These people built a culture around stability, insurance against famine, a meal today that was prepared by the sun and wind of last summer. You make your way through narrow streets lined with stalls. It's soft and warm, steamed in a maize leaf and slightly smoky. You chew slowly, letting the flavors blend and shift. You're tasting the seasons layered together. What was once fresh, now transformed into a new kind of delicious. They're not for snacking, they're for the gods, offered with reverence before anyone dares take a bite. You dry beans, not because you're bored, but because someone, someday, will need them. Preservation is an act of faith that others will come, that community matters, that the future is worth feeding. A child runs past, holding a chuno dumpling like it's a treasure. Somewhere, a flute plays a sleepy tune, and beside you, a woman hands you one last biter, piece of fruit, dried long ago, sweet as memory. You catch snatches of lyrics in Quechua, some old, some invented on the spot, and how ancient Peruvians used food preservation as their emergency protocol. One young singer belts a line that roughly translates to, "Even a dried potato has something to say." The crowd cheers. It's a weirdly powerful anthem. On a small altar, you spot a llama figurine made from dried cheese and wrapped in maize husk. Cute, yes, but also sacred. You recognize a muña, a minty plant that eases altitude sickness. Also peco, used to calm the stomach. Even these were preserved, dried into fragrant bundles that could be steeped in hot water when needed. A kitchen and a pharmacy, all in one. Someone hands you a cup of chicha de jora, the fermented corn drink you've been hearing about for days. You sip cautiously. It's cold, cloudy, with a tangy kick that tastes like sourdough. Got tipsy. Not bad, honestly. You try not to picture it too hard. But hey, it worked. 4 generations. Fires are lit. People settle in for the night. Bellies full and songs trailing into the purple dusk. You sit on the edge of a stone platform, legs dangling, chicha warming your hands. You nibble cautiously. It's sour, gritty, and weirdly addictive. The vendor explains that it was often used in times of food scarcity, portable, compact, and packed with nutrients. Not a snack so much as a strategy. This isn't culinary compromise, it's culinary pride. Chuno dumplings, tawi bean, ochre layered with dried fish and wild herbs, meals assembled from ingredients harvested months ago, or even last year, still flavorful and filling. It has that homebrew charm somewhere between kombucha and old-fashioned beer. And here's a quirky tidbit. In many traditional chichi-making processes, women chew the corn first, using enzymes in their saliva to jumpstart fermentation. Either way, they worked. People gathered, shared resources, and reminded themselves that good planning meant full bellies. They're drinking, laughing, swapping stories about lean years, and full sacks. One woman recalls a time, decades ago, when a surprise frost wiped out fresh crops. "We didn't panic," she says. We had Chuno. The others nod knowingly. At the heart of the plaza, long tables grown beneath feasts, prepared entirely from preserved ingredients. Historians still argue whether these festivals were originally designed to encourage communal storage or whether they were simply practical. A mid-season boost when fresh crops were scarce. You join a group of elders sitting on straw mats beneath a stretched awning. You realize that preserved food isn't just about flavor or nutrition. Some of the food here has ceremonial purpose. A bundle of dried coca leaves lies beside an offering bowl filled with purple maize flour. You wander toward the music, where dancers spin in bright woven skirt. The beat picks up, the tempo rising. You get handed a tamale, made from stored maize flour and filled with preserved vegetables. You pass another stall featuring a less familiar item. Fermented quinoa paste formed into flat discs and dried in the sun. One nearby wall displays bundles of dried herbs, some for cooking, others for medicine. The crowd thins as the sun dips behind the mountains. And you realize something. These people don't just preserve food, they preserve trust. You store potatoes for a reason. Tomorrow, you'll dive into what happens when things do go wrong. Droughts, floods, frost. But for now, you sit back as the festival winds down. The mountain air has a chill now, heavier with the scent of pine and earth dampened by recent rains. You're retracing the journey back through valleys, shadowed by towering peaks. But this time, your mind focuses on what happens when nature doesn't cooperate, when frost kills crops before harvest, or drought stretches on like an unwelcome guest. You've heard the stories. Years when no chuno could be made because the nights stayed too warm. Their preservation systems were designed with redundancy, multiple techniques, layered together like a safety net. Drying, freezing, fermenting, smoking, storing, all combined to outsmart unpredictable mountain weather. Years when floods washed away terraces or locusts swarmed through maize fields. Preservation wasn't just a convenience. It was survival's backup plan. The ingenuity of the ancient Peruvians shines brightest in crisis. You walk past a field where patches of potato plants lie wilted, battered by an unseasonal hailstorm. Offerings of chicha and dried fruits are placed in kukas or field corners as blessings, connecting preservation with spirituality. The same techniques used centuries ago are still in use. Proof that preservation isn't just about food, it's about culture, knowledge, and continuity. You realize that these structures, these systems, these rituals were humanity's way of saying, no matter what the mountain throws at us, we will endure. Nearby, a community gathers, repairing stone walls, clearing drainage ditches, and hauling sacks of stored chuno. The flavors are deep, comforting, and layered, reflecting the complexity of the preservation techniques that created them. They're prepping for winter, knowing that what's preserved now will keep them alive later. A fringe but fascinating practice you learn about is called waru. Waru raised beds, surrounded by water channels. This ancient system created microclimates that protected crops from frost and drought simultaneously. The water acted as a thermal buffer, releasing heat during cold nights and absorbing excess during the day. It's like nature's thermostat. You watch as elders and youth work side by side, repairing these systems. Historians still debate whether the Incas developed waru, or inherited it from pre-Incan cultures like the Tiwanaku. You're invited to taste a stew made with preserved tubers, dried beans, and smoked llamamitol, rehydrated and slow-cooked over an open flame. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some communities, people still perform rituals, asking the mountain gods, or apis, to protect the stored food through the harsh winters. As the sun sets behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the terraces. You sit beside a stone granary, its walls cool to the touch. Tomorrow, you'll explore the llama caravans that transported all this preserved bounty across vast distances. How the Andes' own pack animals were the highways connecting fields, villages, and empires. But tonight, as stars twinkle like distant campfires overhead, you rest, knowing that preservation was more than just a technique. It was a pact between people and their harsh but beautiful land. The sun rises softly over a patchwork of valleys and ridges as you find yourself surrounded by a caravan of llamas. Their gentle eyes, long eyelashes, and the rhythmic clatter of their hooves on rocky paths create a calm atmosphere, almost meditative. This was essential in a landscape where steep ridges and deep gorges isolated villages and farms. The caravans transported sacks of chuno, dried fish, maize, quinoa, and even guano, knitting together an intricate web of supply and demand. These animals are not just beasts of burden, they are the connecting far-flung communities and the preserved foods they so desperately rely on. Llamas could carry up to 70 pounds on their backs, navigating narrow mountain trails that no human could traverse with such ease. You walk alongside the caravan, feeling the steady pace and breathing in the scent of wool, earth, and just a hint of fermented tuber carried in the loads. The air carries stories of countless journeys, of foods that traveled hundreds of miles, from coastal islands to high mountain villages, ensuring nobody went hungry even when local crops failed. The stored food will feed families through winter, fund festivals, and pay tribute to local leaders. The mountains are beautiful but unforgiving, and llamas were the connectors turning survival techniques into a thriving civilization. Historians still argue how organized these caravan networks really were. A misstep could mean food rotting before delivery, or worse, starvation. Some believe they operated like a state-run postal system, with relay points and warehouses, while others think they were looser, community-based efforts relying on kinship ties and trade relationships. Bright reds, deep purples, and sunburst yellows add splashes of life to the earthy. Their padded feet cause minimal trail erosion, helping preserve the fragile mountain paths that supported these vital trade routes. These colors weren't just decorative, they identified community affiliations and caravan roles like uniforms for an ancient supply chain. The caravan leaders, known as Paco, were more than just animal handlers. They were logistical geniuses, managing routes, timing, and load distribution. You noticed the vibrant textiles worn by the caravan members, dyed with natural colors made from plants and insects. A curious fact: llamas have a unique digestive system, allowing them to thrive on tough, sparse vegetation, making them perfect for these journeys. As the caravan reaches a small village perched on a ledge, you watch as sacks are unloaded into a coca. You realize that without these pack animals, the whole food preservation and redistribution system would collapse. Tomorrow, you'll delve into the art of Andean textiles themselves, how the fibers used in these caravans were spun, dyed, and woven with meaning and practicality. But for now, as the sun sets behind serrated peaks and the caravan settles in, you savor the quiet hum of endurance, community, and ancient ingenuity, walking steadily into the dusk. You're back in the village, this time seated inside a weaving hut where thin shafts of light pour through slits in the adobe walls, landing gently on baskets of wool dyed every shade from pomegranate red to lake blue. The air smells faintly of alpaca fiber and the earthy tang of crushed cochineal insects, the source of that brilliant crimson, because, in the ancient Andes, textiles were far more than clothing or decoration. The pattern is tight, deliberate. She hums softly, her hands working without hesitation. you lean closer to one finished cloth and recognize a design you saw earlier on a kulka wall. Rows of zigzags interspersed with diamond shapes, not random. Coded, like a woven signature. There were tools, currency, containers, records, and in many cases, you're here not for food but for the fibers that helped preserve it. The idea that food and fiber were inseparable wasn't poetic, it was practical. These were used in ritual meals or given as tribute offerings of food wrapped in offerings of time and labor. These were used like modern lunch bags, stuffed with dried corn, ochre, or toasted barley. You run your fingers along one, amazed at how soft and yet sturdy it feels, like it could still be used today. The very act of preserving food required something to preserve it in. Beside you, a weaver threads a shuttle back and forth through her loom. You fumble through a few failed knots, nearly dumping imaginary potatoes across the floor. But after a few tries, you get it. A cloth-wrapped basket is passed to you inside. Dried cheese rounds and a handful of toasted broad beans. A preservation system held together not with plastic or barcodes, but with thread, hands, and centuries of know-how. You munch slowly, your fingertips grazing the weave as you eat. Where preserved food fed armies, couriers, pilgrims, and festivals on a scale almost too big to imagine. And let your mind drift tangled in memory, like a strand of yarn pulled slowly from the past. Your own little chuno burrito, a plain weave for everyday rations, a complex brocade for state reserves. In that way, the food wasn't just preserved, it was respected. But there's no debate about one thing. These weavings were essential to storing and transporting preserved food. These weren't just slings. They were carefully crafted squares of tightly woven wool used to bundle food, tools, and even babies. Some pigments used in highland weavings came from antimicrobial plants. Wrapped food not only stayed dry, it resisted decay and insects. A color wasn't just pretty, it could help keep your dinner from spoiling. When filled with freeze-dried potatoes or dried maize, they were cinched up, knotted, and slung over shoulders for the road. May your love last like chuno, they'd say. Crunchy sentiment, but effective. She spins in long, careful pulls, creating thread that will be dyed using local plants, some of which are the same herbs used in cooking or medicine. In the Andes, the line between food and fabric was often blurred. Lightweight, breathable, and water-resistant, thanks to their dense weave, they were the perfect preservation accessory. Historians still argue whether certain textile motifs represented specific family lineages, territories, or types of trade. You examine a set of kisiparinas, the ancient Andean carrying cloths. And here is a quirky tidbit. Some textiles were soaked in salt or natural resins to make them even more durable or insect-resistant, essential when food had to survive months of transport or storage in humid coastal zones. A young girl nearby is spinning wool with a drop spindle, the fibers pulled from a basket of alpaca fleece that is so soft you're tempted to bury your face in it. Your guide shows you a small square of ancient textile found preserved in a mountain burial, still bright after centuries, wrapped around dried food offerings meant to nourish the dead on their long journey. Some cloths were specially woven for storing ceremonial foods. They featured rare dyes or iconography associated with the sun god Inti or the Earth Mother. And then, of course, there were the saxus bags, made with a distinct looped weaving technique, tight enough to hold even tiny grains of quinoa. Some scholars believe that the quality and complexity of a food storage textile signaled its content's importance. You sip a tea made from muna leaves, while one of the elders teaches you how to tie a carrion cloth. Even the dyes had preservation value. And here's something sweet. In some communities, Special food bundles were woven as gifts for newlyweds, tiny sacks of preserved tubers and dried fruits, symbolizing prosperity and longevity. As twilight wraps the village in cool lavender, you sit surrounded by textiles, their colors now dimming in the fading light. It all feels connected now. Food, fiber, memory. Tomorrow you'll journey back toward Cusco to see how all of this, Chunyokipujamas textiles, came together at the very heart of the empire. But tonight, you wrap yourself in a soft alpaca blanket, the smell of manna and maize lingering in the air. You're entering Cusco, now the navel of the Inca Empire, where all roads, rituals, and records once converged. The sun sits low over the stone city, casting long shadows across walls that haven't budged in centuries. These aren't ruins, they're echoes. And in these echoes, you begin to trace the heartbeat of a civilization powered by preserved food. As you wind through the old roadways, you can still feel it. The rhythm of countless footsteps, the low hum of voices, the creak of llama packs shifting under their loads. You pause near a plaza where markets once buzzed with the rustle of sacks, the aroma of dried meat, the shuffle of quipucamayokes trailing their knotted cords behind them like woolen scrolls. But here in Cusco, all those pieces came together. This was the launch pad, the command center, the stomach of an empire. You've spent this whole journey uncovering pieces of the puzzle, Chuno, drying in icy fields, cocos tucked into cliffs, guano scraped from seabird islands, terraces carved into the mountainside like green ladders. It moved, sometimes hidden inside pottery, always intended as provisions for the next world. The ancient Peruvians didn't just preserve food for bad seasons. They preserved it for eternity. Through relay systems, preserved goods flowed into Cusco to support the Sapa Inc., his court, the temples, the armies, and all the complex machinery of imperial power. The wind carries the scent of eucalyptus and wood, and for a moment you can almost hear it, the layered symphony of ancient preservation. Tomorrow you'll leave, but tonight you'll lie beneath the stars that once guided caravans across the Andes and breathe the same thin, cool air those ancient farmers did, still marveling at a culture that turned mountains into food factories, cliffs into cupboards, cold into a freezer, birds into fertilizer, thread into memory, across time, across distance, across every altitude and hardship their empire threw at them. A vocabulary of survival, of care, of community. You don't just eat chuno, you inherit it. The rhythmic patterns of a quipu dancing through your fingertips, the slow simmer of preserved beans in festival stews that warmed your belly and slowed your thoughts, the clatter of llama hooves, the rhythmic tying of quipu knots, the crunch of a sundry doka. Let your mind unfurl like a woven cloth unrolling at the end of a long day. You are, in your own quiet way, preserved. You are no longer climbing, no longer chewing, no longer following winding trails or tying memory knots in cord. The soft whisper of maize being toasted in clay pots. Let the sounds of the highlands fade to quiet memory, the whisper of dry grasses, the low bleat of a distant llama, the soft crunch of dried potatoes beneath your fingers. Picture it. Long tables lined with ceramic vessels of dried fruit, chicha roast meat preserved in slabs, and baskets overflowing with crunchy toasted maize. These weren't emergency rations. These were banquets of resilience, a double proof of an empire's reach. From woven sacks of quinoa to labyrinthine stone granaries tucked into mountain cliffs, each step revealed not just a preservation method, but a way of thinking, of stretching time, of buffering against uncertainty, of caring for those yet to come. The food stored across the empire didn't just stay in its local region. Historians still debate whether the stored food was taxed from every community or given voluntarily as tribute, but either way, it got here. And when it did, it was distributed not just to feed mouths, but to build loyalty. He gestures to a set of carved niches and tells you that once upon a time they were filled not just with sacred idols, but with food offerings, dried coca, toasted barley, even small packets of cured llama meat. In Incan culture, food wasn't just for the living, it was for gods, spirits, and ancestors. A town in need might receive chuno from a far-off province. A victorious general might be rewarded with a load of prized maize beer. You pass a stone platform where feasts were once held. There's an elder guide who invites you into a shaded corner of the temple ruins. And here is a final quirky fact for you. Archaeological digs near Cusco have uncovered carefully preserved bundles of food buried with high-ranking individuals, sometimes wrapped in fine cloth. You sit for a while beneath the remains of a stone aqueduct that once watered terraced gardens stretching along the city, and now here you are, centuries later, still tasting that ingenuity. These people preserved more than just calories. They preserved connection. And maybe, in the quiet between footsteps and campfires and footsteps again, you begin to understand that food wasn't just fuel, it was language. As the sky over Cusco deepens into dusk, and the last rays paint the city gold, you wrap up the journey in your mind. And now, let your breathing slow now. You've traveled far tonight, from freezing midnight fields to guano-covered islands. You remember the cool stillness of a Kulka interior, where silence was broken only by your own breath. Let those memories settle now like the last light settling into the valleys of the Andes. Let the mountain air become heavier, softer. You are still, you are safe. Let that gentle hum of preservation, the deep patience of an ancient people wrap around you like a blanket spun from alpaca wool and whispered traditions. No frost tonight, no hunger, no storm, only rest. And the soft memory of how people, long ago, learned to keep the future safe, one sun-dried bite at a time.